morning air was sharp with that unmistakable downtown Chicago buzz jackets, clutched tight heels clicking on pavement steam, rising from sidewalk grates like the city itself was exhaling stress. Naomi Ellis stepped into Blue House Brew, a modest coffee shop nestled between a yoga studio and an overpriced boutique that never seemed to have customers. The place was humming softly with morning rush chatter, a jazz playlist spilling from overhead speakers. She moved with quiet confidence, black wool coat buttoned up a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Her curls were pulled back into a low twist, the kind of hairstyle that said, "I'm not here to impress, I'm here to handle things." She joined the short line eyes scanning the menu not because she needed to, but because the motion gave her hands something to do. Ahead of her, a man in gym clothes ordered 2 protein smoothies and a triple espresso. Behind her, someone coughed impatiently. The line moved. The cashier, young too chipper for this hour, gave her a bright smile as she stepped up. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" "Large latte, extra shot," Naomi said, reaching into her bag. Her voice was calm, unbothered. She pulled out her wallet and swiped the first card. Declined. A quiet beep, the kind that feels much louder when there are eyes behind you. "Sorry it didn't go through," the cashier said, his voice suddenly lower-laced with that awkward customer service discomfort. Naomi didn't flinch. She handed over another card, declined again. A man behind her exhaled. The energy in the room shifted just barely but enough. It wasn't pity, not yet. It was that creeping blend of irritation and judgment. Naomi could feel it pressing against her back like a shove. Still, her expression didn't change. This wasn't the first time she'd been watched like this. It wouldn't be the last. "That's all right," she said, steady. She reached for a third card, fingers grazing the edge, but then a voice too familiar cut through the space between her and the world. "Hey," it said, loud enough to perform, but casual enough to pretend otherwise. "Just add her drink to mine. No big deal." Naomi froze, not from panic, but from recognition. She turned slowly as if giving herself time to process what she already knew. Richard Langford stood behind her. Immaculate navy overcoat, tailored slacks, that same self-satisfied half-smile he wore like cologne. He looked good, still fit, still polished, still the kind of man who believed charm could cover everything. Naomi's jaw tightened ever so slightly, emotion so small it went unnoticed by everyone except herself. "I've got it," Richard told the cashier, already flashing his Amex like a knight offering a sword. "Come on," he said, smiling at Naomi. "Happens to all of us, right?" She stared at him for a long second, lips parted slightly, not quite smiling, not quite offended. It wasn't surprise she felt. It was precision, the sharp, controlled inhale of someone who had waited for this moment without ever expecting it to arrive like this. "No problem," Richard continued. "Just a coffee." The payment went through. Naomi took the drink with a quiet, "Thank you," her tone cool, almost professional. Not a hint of gratitude. She turned without another word, but not before noticing that Richard didn't recognize her. Not a flicker. Not even a pause of curiosity. To him, she was just another stranger, with a declined card, a nameless woman of color he could use as a dinner anecdote to feel morally generous. As she stepped back into the cold, the warmth of the coffee seeped into her gloves. In her bag, an envelope brushed against her hip. Heavy, not with paper but with meaning. Inside were contracts, signatures, investments, leverage. The culmination of 6 months of building something in the dark. Something he would never see coming. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. Richard Langford had just paid $5.80 for a coffee. In doing so, he'd bought himself a front row seat to the unraveling of everything he had ever built, and he didn't even know it. Naomi smiled, not out of gratitude, not even satisfaction. It was the kind of smile that whispered, "You have no idea who you just underestimated." Naomi walked past the corner trash can overflowing with holiday cups and headed down Michigan Avenue, each step deliberate, steady. The coffee in her hand had already cooled, but she didn't care. What she carried now had nothing to do with caffeine. It was memory distilled and boiling under the surface. Her breath came out in calm puffs, eyes focused straight ahead. But in her mind, she was somewhere else, back in that high-glass boardroom 6 months ago, where everything shifted. She remembered standing in front of a long table filled with expensive pens, expensive watches, and men who inherited their titles. Her presentation had been sharp, refined, 42 slides of data-backed brilliance. Market trends, fiscal projections, implementation timelines. The kind of plan that could save a company from collapse or launch it into another stratosphere. She had worked through Knight's-run models backward and forward, stress-tested the strategies like an engineer fine-tuning an engine. And yet when she finished, there was silence. The kind of silence that isn't about contemplation, but condescension. At the head of the table sat Richard Langford, spinning his Mont Blanc pen between his fingers like a bored magician. He didn't even look up as he said, "That's an interesting perspective, Naomi. But don't you think you may be overestimating our company's ability to evolve? We have traditions, legacies." Naomi had felt the blood rush to her ears, but she didn't blink. She smiled, nodded, and sat down, knowing exactly what tradition meant in that room. It meant her presence was already too much. It meant they'd never let someone like her, not just a woman, but a black woman, be the architect of their salvation. 3 weeks later, Richard stood in that same room wearing her strategy like a tailored suit. Every bullet point, every pivot, every word presented as if it had sprung from his own genius. The board applauded. The investors cheered. Naomi, meanwhile, was called into his office the next morning. "You've done good work," he said, tone overly casual, as if he were offering career advice to an intern. "But maybe it's time you find a space that aligns more with your background. Something community-driven. I hear NGOs are always looking for passionate minds." He didn't fire her with cruelty. He fired her with civility, which somehow made it worse. Like he believed he was doing her a favor. Now, walking through the city she once felt shut out of, Naomi carried not bitterness, but clarity. The envelope in her purse wasn't just a launch pad, it was evidence. Proof that you can't keep pushing people out without expecting them to build something of their own. When she stepped into the elevator of a modest office building tucked behind the Riverwalk, she was met with the familiar scent of ink and ambition. The 15th floor belonged to Genesis Insight Group, a firm that technically hadn't even gone public yet. But already its foundation was solid, quiet, dangerous. Inside, her team was waiting, not employees, partners. Kenji, who had been the best IT director Langford & Co. had ever seen before, he was labeled too foreign. Isabel, who had questioned pay gaps and found herself restructured out. Julian, a legal prodigy, who'd been told he was a better fit for a compliance role. And Aaron, the inside voice. The loyal executive assistant who never stopped believing that Naomi hadn't been wrong, just too right for the wrong people. Naomi closed the door behind her, set her coffee down, and opened the envelope with quiet ceremony. She laid the signed documents on the table and said, without needing to raise her voice, "Langford & Co. has just reached out." Aaron confirmed it with a small nod. "He's asking for external strategy consulting. Says he wants fresh perspective." The room fell still for a beat. Naomi leaned forward, her tone calm and razor-sharp. "They want help fixing the problem they created. They just don't know we are the help." The team didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They simply nodded like warriors sharpening blades. Naomi glanced at the window where the skyline stretched tall and indifferent. Somewhere out there, Richard Langford was sipping a second latte, convinced he had the upper hand. She smiled faintly. He still had no idea. The silence that followed Naomi's words wasn't empty, it was focused. The kind of silence that settles before the start of something irreversible. Across the table, Kenji flipped open his laptop, fingers already dancing across the keyboard. Isabel leaned back in her chair, arms crossed but eyes sharp. Julian picked up a legal pad, his pen tapping once, then pausing, as if waiting for the storm to begin. Naomi sat down slowly, letting the weight of what she had just confirmed settle into the room. "Langford doesn't know who we are," she said. "To him, we're just another boutique firm with a modern logo and some eager consultants. He doesn't recognize the hands that built his success, let alone the ones he burned on his way up." Kenji looked up. "He will." A soft hum of agreement passed around the room. Naomi reached into her bag again and retrieved a slim folder marked simply Phase 1. "He wants an initial proposal by Friday," Aaron said, glancing at her phone. "I've been feeding him subtle references to Genesis for weeks. He thinks he found us on his own." "Perfect," Julian muttered. "Let him keep thinking he's in control." Naomi opened the folder, revealing the blueprint of a strategy that mirrored the very same one Langford had once stolen, but this time redesigned not to save a company, but to expose it. "We're not sabotaging Naomi," reminded them, her voice calm. "We're offering real solutions, just not the kind he's expecting." Isabel raised an eyebrow. "You mean not the kind that hide the rot behind diversity posters and empty mission statements?" "Exactly," Naomi's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're not here to help him paint over the cracks. We're going to map out exactly why the foundation is failing." Kenji swiveled his laptop toward the group. "I've been organizing the archive emails, memos, system logs, everything from the old servers I kept before they locked me out." He clicked open a folder titled Cleansing Notes. An email appeared on screen from Richard, dated just a few weeks before Naomi's departure. "We need to phase out elements that dilute our core culture. Too many voices at the table lead to chaos. Strategic clarity requires selective leadership." Julian scoffed. "Selective leadership. That's a poetic way to say white and male." Another email followed, this time regarding Naomi's final proposal. "Brilliant structure. Too bad it's coming from the wrong messenger. We'll rework it under my name for the January rollout." Isabel's fists clenched. Naomi, however, remained composed. "I cataloged every insult, not for revenge, for reference." The room fell into a rhythm after that ideas shared files, cross-referenced timelines outlined. Aaron sent Naomi the latest update. Langford had scheduled a preliminary meeting with Genesis for Monday at 3 p.m., full board attendance. "Press invited. He's planning a PR stunt," Aaron said. "Wants to show off how open-minded he is. New ideas, fresh blood, clean slate." Naomi's laugh was soft, unamused. "Let him roll out the red carpet. We'll bring the mirror." As the team settled into their roles, rebuilding strategies, fine-tuning presentations, cross-checking legal protections, Naomi stood and walked to the window. The sun had dropped lower, tinting the Chicago skyline in honeyed amber. Her reflection met her gaze, but it wasn't the same woman who had stood in that boardroom 6 months ago, waiting for validation that never came. She whispered, not for anyone to hear, but for herself, "You tried to erase me, but I learned how to rewrite." Behind her, the printer hummed to life. Phase 1 printed and bound, ready to be hand-delivered to the very man who had no idea he was about to pay to watch his empire begin to crumble. And in that moment, Naomi didn't feel vindicated. She felt ready. Monday arrived dressed in sharp suits and high expectations. The elevator ride up to the 25th floor of Langford & Coer's corporate headquarters was almost too quiet, the kind of silence you hear before a concert starts or a verdict is read. Naomi stood in the center of the elevator, her team flanking her like sentinels. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Everyone knew the plan. Everyone knew why they were here. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped into a lobby made of glass and marble, cold, grand, performative. The receptionist, unaware of the history that echoed through every step Naomi took, smiled politely and gestured toward the boardroom. "They're expecting you." Of course they were. Inside, the long conference table gleamed under sterile lighting. Richard Langford was already there, standing with the confident stance of a man used to controlling a room. He was shaking hands with a trio of reporters from the Chicago Ledger, clearly expecting a photo op. Naomi clocked it immediately. The performance had begun. "Naomi Ellis," Richard said, his voice warm and shallow. "It's great to have you. I have to say I was inspired when we met last week. Such poise, even in a tough moment. That's exactly the kind of resilience we need more of in this industry." Naomi shook his hand with the practiced smile of someone who had spent years learning how to navigate men who thought flattery was a substitute for respect. "Thank you, Mr. Langford. It's good to be back." He didn't catch the double meaning. Of course he didn't. They took their seats. The board members filed in slowly, most of them middle-aged, most of them wearing the same expressions Naomi remembered, detached, polite, unimpressed. Aaron sat near the reporter's phone in hand, ready to record everything. Kenji connected the laptop to the projector. Isabel opened the pitch deck. Julian laid out printed copies of the executive summary with methodical care. Naomi stood at the head of the table. "Today's presentation will walk through a complete diagnostic of your operational structure," she began. "Our objective is simple: show you where your internal fractures lie and how to rebuild before they become catastrophic." Richard chuckled lightly. Well, catastrophic feels like a strong word. Naomi tilted her head. Then I suggest we begin. She clicked to the first slide. A chart appeared, stark, unsparing. It showed the company's declining client retention rate over the last 18 months. Isabel chimed in, outlining the measurable revenue losses from contracts that had once been considered unshakable. Kenji followed, showing back-end data that revealed inefficiencies, high turnover rates among mid-level managers, and underperformance in key departments. The numbers spoke louder than the room. Naomi moved to the next slide. These issues didn't appear out of nowhere. They're the result of long-term structural blindness, specifically a culture that favors legacy over merit. That got a reaction. One of the older board members leaned forward. Are you implying that we're outdated? I'm not implying anything, Naomi replied. I'm presenting your own data. Richard shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. Let's focus on solutions, shall we? We will, Naomi said, calm and steady, but context matters. Then she clicked again, and the room changed. A grainy audio file began to play through the speakers. Richard's voice, recorded in a meeting Naomi hadn't attended, but had certainly been affected by, let's be real, diversity looks good on paper. But when it comes to decision-making, it slows things down. We need clarity, not chaos. A thick silence dropped over the table. A reporter's pen stopped mid-scribble. Naomi let it breathe for a beat. That clip was from a strategy meeting 15 months ago. Since then, 11 employees have been quietly let go. All of them, coincidentally, were either women, people of color, or both. Julian slid a folder toward the center of the table. Here are the HR records to support that. Richard's smile had vanished. Naomi continued, these decisions have consequences. Cultural, legal, financial. And today you asked us here to fix your problems. But first you need to understand you created them. She clicked to the final slide of the segment. Bold letters filled the screen. You can't solve a crisis by denying it exists. The air felt heavier now. The boardroom had gone from stage to courtroom. Naomi stood composed, unwavering, as the weight of truth settled around her like armor. And this was only the beginning. No one moved. The only sound in the room was the soft, mechanical whir of the projector cooling down. Naomi didn't break eye contact with the board. She didn't need to raise her voice. The evidence had already spoken louder than any speech could. Richard, for the first time in the meeting, looked visibly rattled. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting toward the reporters, then to the board, then finally settling briefly on Naomi. She saw it then. Not fear, not even guilt, but realization. He finally knew who she was. You were with us before, he said, voice faltering, just enough for the edges of his polish to crack. You did strategy, right? A few years ago, 6 months ago, Naomi corrected her tone, crisp. Director of Strategy and Innovation, until I was advised rather delicately to seek opportunities more aligned with my background. A sharp inhale came from one of the women on the board. Another member flipped through the folder Julian had handed out, visibly pale. Richard tried to regain control. This feels personal, Naomi. We brought you here to consult, not to dig up old grievances. Naomi smiled, small, sharp, devastating. You didn't bring me here. You brought Genesis insight, and we came to do what we do best, deliver clarity. She turned to Isabel, who clicked forward to the next part of the presentation. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was surgical. Kenji unveiled a timeline of internal decisions, cross-referenced with public press releases, lies made to shareholders, DEI statistics padded with contract workers during audit season, rebranded strategies that matched Naomi's original pitch line for line. And then came the final blow, a breakdown of the $52 million in lost contracts since Naomi's dismissal, all of which had quietly migrated to Genesis Insight or its partners. One of the reporters was now typing furiously. Another had started recording audio on her phone. Richard looked stunned. Wait, those clients, Naomi cut in gently. They didn't leave because of market trends. They left because they recognized something you never did. Talent isn't a risk. It's your only real asset. She paused, then walked to the window. The city stretched out beneath them, tall and indifferent. She didn't need to look back to feel the boardroom behind her shifting. She already knew. The balance of power had changed. When you let me go, she said quietly, you thought you were closing a door. What you didn't see was that I'd already started building another one. She turned around slowly, hands open, voice steady. 15 former employees you called unfit now lead multi-million-dollar firms. We didn't just walk away. We walked forward. A beat of silence passed. Then Julian stood laying one final folder on the table. This includes a list of federal compliance breaches tied to the company's diversity misreporting. We've already alerted the appropriate legal channels. You'll be contacted formally within the week. Richard sank further into his chair, his voice barely audible. You planned this from the start. Naomi nodded once. The moment you stole my work, erased my name, and called it vision, that's when I began. Outside, the sun had dipped just far enough to throw long shadows across the boardroom floor. Naomi gathered her materials, her team silently doing the same. She paused at the door, looked back at Richard one last time. Thank you, she said, soft but clear, for the coffee. Then she walked out, not vindicated, not victorious, but complete. And behind her, an empire built on arrogance began piece by piece to fall apart. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the echo of that moment followed Naomi all the way down the hall. It wasn't just the sound of her leaving the boardroom, it was the sound of something collapsing behind her, something long overdue. As the elevator descended, her reflection in the polished steel walls met her gaze. There was no smugness, no dramatic satisfaction, only stillness. She had done what needed to be done, and now the rest would take care of itself. By the time she stepped back onto the sidewalk, her phone was buzzing nonstop, news alerts, emails, LinkedIn pings. Reporters were already circling the story. A whistleblower CEO, a failing corporation, exposed in real time, a corporate giant brought to its knees by the very people it discarded. Later that evening, Naomi sat by the window of her apartment, curled on the edge of a slate-gray armchair, with a glass of wine untouched in her hand. Across the room, her television was tuned to a business news segment. Richard's name flashed across the screen beneath the headline, Langford & Co. faces corporate reckoning after internal documents leak. She didn't turn up the volume. She didn't need to hear it. The story was no longer his. It was bigger now, about more than one man or one boardroom. The next morning, Genesis Insight Group trended on every major platform. By noon, their inbox had over 100 requests for proposals, not just from struggling companies, but from investment firms, educational institutions, even government departments. Everyone wanted to know how they'd done it, how they'd seen through the polite poison of corporate culture and not only survived, but turned it into fuel. Kenji walked into her office holding his phone. You're going to want to see this. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Please don't say it's Richard crying on YouTube. Worse, Kenji said, laughing as he handed her the phone. It's his new LinkedIn video. She pressed play. Richard, now noticeably thinner, seated in a plain room, with a bookshelf that screamed borrowed credibility. His voice, once firm, now carried the edge of practiced humility. Hi, I'm Richard Langford, he began, and I'm seeking new opportunities within organizations that value diversity, inclusion, and innovative leadership. Naomi couldn't help the soft laugh that escaped. He's using the very words he used to mock. There's more, Kenji said, sliding a second message across her desk. He applied. To us, Kenji nodded. Asked if there were any openings at Genesis. Said he admires our mission and would love a chance to contribute to our growth. Naomi stared at the screen for a moment, then leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, like she couldn't believe the universe's sense of humor. But of course she could. Men like Richard always believed they could pivot out of consequences, that redemption could be claimed like severance. What should I write back? Kenji asked, already half grinning. Naomi smiled. Keep it short. By that afternoon, Richard received a curt email from Genesis Insight's HR team. Dear Mr. Langford, thank you for your interest in Genesis Insight. At this time, your experience does not align with our company's values of respect, transparency, and ethical leadership. We wish you the best in your job search. The message went viral. A week later, Naomi stood before a packed room at a leadership summit in D.C., delivering a keynote titled, The Cost of Erasure: What Happens When You Underestimate the Right People. I wasn't trying to destroy anything, she told the audience. I was trying to build something no one could take from me again. The applause was long rising. Afterward, a young black woman approached her notebook in hand, eyes shining. How did you stay so calm through it all? Naomi smiled, her answer quiet and certain. Because I knew I wasn't alone. I carried all of us in that room. And she did. Every woman told she was too much. Every voice dismissed as too different. Every brilliant mind told they weren't the right fit. She had carried them like armor. And now the world was finally listening. Weeks passed, but the aftershocks didn't fade. Langford and Co. unraveled piece by piece. Investors pulled out, government contracts suspended, internal investigations launched. The empire Richard Langford had spent decades polishing with press releases and panel appearances was now crumbling in the headlines, and there was no salvaging the myth. What once seemed like legacy now looked like liability. Meanwhile, Naomi stood in the center of something entirely different, something living. Genesis Insight had expanded so fast they'd moved into a new building overlooking the river, one with wide windows and open spaces, the kind that made room for thinking, for breathing. The walls were filled with photos, not of awards but of people. Her team, the ones who once sat in the shadows of boardrooms like ghosts, now seated at the table as equals. On a quiet Thursday morning, Naomi stepped into the cafe where everything had begun, Blue House Brew. Same barista, same jazz playlist humming through the speakers, the same smell of espresso clinging to the brick walls. But this time something was different. She didn't wait in line. The barista saw her and grinned. "Ms. Ellis," he said with a nod of reverence, "the usual." She chuckled softly. "Yeah, let's keep it old school. One large latte, extra shot." As he prepared the drink, she noticed a copy of Forbes on the counter beside the tip jar. Her own face stared back, poised beneath the headline, "The $6 lesson that cost a fortune." The barista caught her glance and tapped the cover gently. "That story," he said, "it's been making people talk. Not just in business. Everywhere." Naomi nodded, accepting the coffee and the moment with equal grace. "Good," she said. "Talking is where it starts." Outside, the city moved, as it always did, fast, restless, half listening. She walked slowly this time, letting herself feel the rhythm of it. The noise didn't overwhelm her like it used to. It felt earned. Back at Genesis, Isabel was finalizing a contract with a Fortune 100 client. Kenji was coordinating a university partnership program. Julian was reviewing proposals from nonprofits they planned to advise pro bono. The work was growing, but more than that, it was working. Later that evening, the team gathered in their new conference room. The atmosphere wasn't flashy, it was warm, intentional. They weren't celebrating a takedown. They were honoring what had been built in its place. "We didn't win because we were smarter," Naomi said, raising a glass of sparkling cider, "though we are. We didn't win because we fought harder. Though let's be honest, we did that too." Everyone chuckled. "We won," she continued, "because we stopped asking for space and started creating our own." Around the table, the nods were quiet but powerful. They all knew what it meant to be the only voice in a room. They all knew what it meant to be tolerated but never truly heard. Until now. As the night settled and people trickled out one by one, Naomi lingered by the window. The skyline sparkled. Somewhere out there, Richard Langford was probably still rewriting his resume, trying to sound like a man who had learned his lesson. But Naomi didn't think of him much anymore. He wasn't the point. He never really was. The real story was here in this room, in these people in the future they had chosen to make real. She sipped her drink and smiled, not for victory, but for something better. Freedom. Because the best revenge had never been about destruction. It was building something so strong, so undeniable, that no one could ever erase her again. If this story moved you, reminded you of your own worth, or lit a fire you thought had gone out, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let someone else feel seen. And if you believe in stories that uplift, that expose truth, and that prove underdogs can rise, subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your voice. Thank you for watching.